write this book 10 months after my epiphany and have it come out now in the final months before the presidential election on November 8th. 7 top historians had presidential biographies come out in 2015. So I found out where their book tours were going, and I lined up programs with them on their tours. Next, I got cooperation from 7 different colleges to do interview programs with presidential experts in front of their students, including one college, the King's College in New York City, who allowed me to put on a presidential symposium where I did 5 interviews in 3 days. Next, I lined up 3 leading historians who had written biographies of more than one president. So I got twofers, doing interviews with them on both presidents that they'd written about. Next, some historians who I knew before February 2015 introduced me to their presidential biographer friends and nudged them to do interviews with me. And most of them said yes when they learned that they were going to be part of a book with David McCullough, Ken Burns, and Henry Kissinger. Sounded pretty good. Last but not least, my law firm, Winstead, allowed me to do 7 interview programs with big-name historians in front of our clients at business development events. So you put all these factors together, and the momentum for getting the interviews completed for my one big thing, presidential history project, took off like a rocket. Pulitzer-winning historian Taylor Branch, who I interviewed at UT Austin about LBJ and civil rights, told the audience he viewed me as a force of nature, which reminded me of George Bernard Shaw's words. True joy in life comes from being used for a purpose, recognized as a mighty one, that allows someone to become a force of nature. Instead of a feverish, selfish little clod of ailments and grievances complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. Here was my process for the interviews. First, I devoured each author's book, zooming in on each biography's most intriguing areas. Then I crafted my questions, and I never showed the questions in advance because I wanted to have a Perry Mason air of truth-seeking mystery about me. Then I conducted, taped, and had transcribed each interview. And then I edited the transcript, took out all the uhs and the you knows, broke up all the run-on sentences, broke up all the long answers into paragraphs to make it as tight a piece of writing as I could make it. And then last, I sent my final draft to the person who I'd interviewed, David McCullough, Ken Burns, whoever, and he made the final edit, meaning the final product of every transcript in this book has been blessed by every expert who I interviewed. Now you might wonder, has anyone ever done this before? Answer, no. And then you might ask, well, why do it now? The best answer to that question comes from 2 impeccable sources. First, support for my idea to do interviews now with presidential experts comes from Pulitzer Prize winner Annette Gordon Reed and UVA history professor Peter Onuf, who make a keen observation in their new Thomas Jefferson biography, Most Blessed of the Patriarchs, that ties into what I was trying to do with cross-examining history. They said, every generation of historians asks different questions about the material that's available to them. Second, support for doing my interview book now comes from Ken Burns in giving the Jefferson Lecture at the Kennedy Center earlier this year. History is the set of questions we in the present ask of our past. Now, at this time in the 21st century, we are now in the present asking different questions about our presidents than those asked by historians from prior generations. Because now there's so much more material to us about our past, thanks to there being so many great new presidential biographies researched and written by our top historians just in the last 25 years. Now, earlier generations of presidential historians largely wanted to focus on just the positive aspects of our top leaders' lives and presidencies. They didn't want to dig into the facts about what Thomas Jefferson was doing with his slaves at Monticello, or how Andrew Jackson treated the Native Americans when he drove them from their lands, or what role Abraham Lincoln played in starting the Civil War, or the extent of John F. Kennedy's sexual indiscretions. Now, today's historians are all about digging into all the facts, researching the details of all the people in a president's network, turning over every rock, running every rabbit trail, reading every letter they can find, and trying to figure out who wrote every anonymous newspaper editorial. And to me, what's happening with historians in the modern era is a good thing. We shouldn't want to know about the lives of our presidents based on half-truths and wishful thinking. We should want to know them warts and all to understand what Ken Burns calls their emotional archaeology. Now, here's the best explanation for why knowing more about them is a good thing for us. Samuel Johnson, the man who wrote the first great dictionary, long ago told us why we need to know our heroes completely, the good and the bad. If nothing but the bright side of characters is shown, we should all sit down in despondency and think it utterly impossible to imitate them in anything. Now, some of the questions that I asked of the experts in cross-examining history were the following. Since by his own admission, he wasn't brilliant, exactly what was it that made George Washington stand head and shoulders above all of the other founders? As one of the most principled founders on the subject of free speech up through the time the Constitution was ratified, why did President John Adams support the Sedition Act, which nullified freedom of speech and freedom of the press for the last 2 years of his presidency? Explain the hypocrisy of Thomas Jefferson writing the Declaration of Independence, magical words, all men are created equal, while spending his adult life owning hundreds of slaves and fathering children with one particular slave. Is it fair to demonize Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson using a 21st century sensibility in evaluating how they lived and thought in their environments during the late 18th and early 19th centuries? Did Abraham Lincoln violate the Constitution while serving as commander-in-chief during the Civil War? If so, was that a forgivable or an unforgivable sin? And why was Lincoln always more focused on the Declaration of Independence than the Constitution? Did Theodore Roosevelt's frenzied life choices as the man in the arena ultimately cause him to cross the thin line that separates genius from insanity? Is speak softly and carry a big stick still a sound foreign policy strategy in the 21st century? How could a deeply religious man like Woodrow Wilson be such a racist and a hate monger? And does Wilson's foreign policy objective to make the world safe for democracy still make sense as a policy in the 21st century? How did Franklin Roosevelt defy polio and use it as a driving force in his political rise? And how does the Franklin-Eleanor separate lives marriage compare with Bill and Hillary Clinton's marriage? Why has historians' appreciation for Dwight Eisenhower's presidency skyrocketed in the last 50 years? How should we grade Eisenhower in the understated ways he dealt with McCarthyism, civil rights, and Vietnam? What exactly was John F. Kennedy doing in Cuba that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis? Was Kennedy's death the greatest thing that happened to the advancement of civil rights in America, since JFK had no skill at getting congressional legislation passed? Did JFK actually write the book, Profiles in Courage, for which he won the Pulitzer Prize? Given the controversy over the movie Selma, what was the true nature of the relationship between LBJ and Martin Luther King? And if LBJ was such a grand champion of civil rights, then why did he vote against every civil rights bill in Congress from 1937 until 1957? And in 57, he watered the 57 bill down to almost nothing before it finally passed. Did LBJ's extreme focus on his civil rights strategy cause him to miss the boat with his Vietnam strategy? Did Richard Nixon attempt to sabotage the Paris peace talks on the eve of the 1968 election? In Oliver Stone's film, was Anthony Hopkins' portrayal of Nixon's craziness during Watergate accurate? What caused Ronald Reagan to be so distant from everyone except his wife, Nancy? Was compromise a dirty word for Reagan? How much was he involved in the Iran-Contra scandal? Why did George H.W. Bush never write his presidential memoirs, even though he maintained a tape-recorded diary throughout his presidency? Did he know he was making a promise that he couldn't keep at the 1988 Republican convention when he told the country, "Read my lips, no new taxes"? Why was Bush ready to risk impeachment by pushing forward with the Gulf War, regardless of how Congress voted on it? What did Bill Clinton see in Hillary during their time together at Yale Law School? And why did she move to Arkansas and marry him knowing that he was hardwired for infidelity? And what is it about Bill Clinton that has caused his life to be a perpetual cycle of loss and recovery? Was George W. Bush's goal to be a nation builder in Iraq a case of dreaming the impossible dream and tilting at a windmill? Does Bush 43 deserve the criticism he's received over the federal government's response to Hurricane Katrina? Was John Roberts sufficiently vetted for the Supreme Court by the Bush team? Why are so many of our recent presidents friendless loners? Why do opposites attract in the President's Club and enemies become friends post-presidency, like Hoover and Truman, Ford and Carter, and the two Bushes and Clinton? Okay, those are some of the questions that I wanted answered as I traveled around the country interviewing the experts, and I'm here to tell you I got answers from some of America's most esteemed historians and White House insiders. And for those of you who want to know how to find out the answers to these questions, I have an idea where you can find them. Now, as you've heard my story tonight that I'm sticking to because it happens to be true, I hope it will lead you to find your story and cause you to think about where you are now in life and what your experience, talents, and passions are, and then I hope you can put them all together and figure out one big thing that you want to pursue and then go for it. And and may you have as much fun doing it as I did with cross-examining history. I'll promise you one thing. You'll succeed with your one big thing only if you're bold. Boldness will put you over the top. And Goethe explains why. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it. Only with boldness can you become a force of nature. Now, some of you may be sitting out there now thinking about your one big thing, and instead of feeling bold, you may be feeling afraid to take on a big new challenge at this stage in your life. And if you're feeling fearful, remember these words from Kierkegaard. To venture causes anxiety, but not to venture is to lose oneself. Now, I'll close my remarks tonight by reading the last part in the acknowledgement section of my book, which is the part where the author thanks all those people who were instrumental to his books coming together. And this passage will provide the answer to those here who may be wondering, what derailed my childhood career goal of pursuing the presidency when I grow up? Quote, for my final acknowledgement, I want to thank those members of the University of Texas at Austin student body who voted against me in the student governmental presidential election in the spring of 1975. By causing me to lose that election after months of fierce campaigning on and off campus, that experience made me realize that the life of a political candidate was not for me. It taught me that politics requires those running for office to brown nose and scratch others' backs. And I learned in that election that those necessary political talents were tools that just were not found in my toolkit. Now, the decision by the UT student voters to reject me was transformative. It brought to an end my childhood dream, fantasy of becoming president of the United States. And since then, I've never run again for political office, and that has freed me up to pursue other dreams that fit me far better than politics ever could have, particularly as we look at the sordid nature of presidential politics in 2016. God bless divine providence that removed me from the presidential rat race once and for all in the spring of 1975 before I reached my 22nd birthday. Now, I started tonight with words from Colin Ray. I'll end with words from Garth Brooks. Sometimes I thank God for unanswered prayers. Thank you.
And Talmage, will you take some questions?
Yeah, questions.
Anybody got a question on this side or that side? Two microphones.
Questions, comments.
I just wondered if you kept up with the man who beat you in that election and what he's doing now.
As a matter of fact, I have, and in fact, it was not a man. As a matter of fact, I lost to the first woman elected president student body at the University of Texas. And that woman, whose name then was Carol Crabtree, is now Carol Crabtree Donovan, is the head of the Democratic Party in Dallas County.
Did you do any work with President Obama and his administration?
Say it again.
Did you do anything with President Obama and his administration?
No, and the reason I didn't get a biographer of either President Bush or President Obama, and the reason is because I think it's too close in time for anybody to really have any sort of historical perspective. I did interview Andy Card and ask him all kinds of questions about the Bush 43 presidency. That's why I mentioned that, because the Andy Card interview goes into those questions. And the first big biography of President Bush 43 just came out in the last week. I just thought it was premature. But this book is 500 pages, and it's heavy. I don't know why it's so heavy, but it's big enough. It'll give you a lot of reading.
Hey, Talmage, over here.
Marvin, I'd know
hear
that
the
voice
voice.
anywhere.
Yeah, hey. So you're dreaming big tonight. What's next?
Well, what's next is the book comes out on August the 30th, actually. And the big launch event is at the Pecan Room at Old Parkland with the World Affairs Council. And then I'll be speaking all over the country, from San Francisco to Boston, everywhere in between, to the World Affairs Councils in 9 different cities, to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., to the Bush Presidential Library here, the one in College Station, and the U.S. Grant Presidential Library. So